Red 2 standing by, all 4 lit and in the green. Welcome back to Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, where the hot laps hopefully get hotter and the bios for the characters get a little bit more interesting. We have a fairly arrogant pilot on show in the form of the Fui, Mars Guo. We also have the surprisingly impressive Ebe Endocott showing off his skills as well. You might remember Mars Guo as the guy who got his pod racer blown up by Sebulba. But just what is his story? What's Ebe Endocott's story? Let's get to finding out all about them and their races in today's episode. Very glad to have you along. Mars Guo is a Fui from the planet Fu, showing some fairly imaginative naming there. In fairness, they are also known as Bardotans. He had a reputation as an arrogant blowhard, showing a propensity for heavy drinking and a fondness for women, also tending to pick fights due to his diminutive stature. This managed to get him in a lot of trouble, but it was the womanizing that ultimately brought him the most grief. It didn't help that his slaves found him to be a cruel master as well. Having proven himself as a fairly capable pilot in the minor leagues, Mars Guo set out to make a name for himself in the Bunta Classic. Unfortunately, he made the unwise decision to get hammered at Bols Rua's Glimmick concert the night before the race, and compounded this by trying to win the affections of Sebulba's Twi'lek masseuse Anne Geller. Tinto Pagalis, who had been trying to win Anne's affections for himself, overheard this and reported the incident to Sebulba. The Dug subtly sabotaged Guo's pod racer with the intent of having him crash. It makes me wonder, what about Anne's sister Tan? Everybody seems to forget about her. But despite the sabotage, Guo actually managed to race fairly well in the Bunta Classic, right up until Sebulba decided to properly finish him off. The giant air intakes of Guo's pod racer proved an easy target, and Sebulba hurled a piece of iron into one of Guo's engines. The end result was a spectacular crash and explosion which nearly disabled the nearby Anakin's pod racer. However, unlike everyone who's not named Rats Tyrell, Guo survived the spectacular destruction of his pod racer. While he recovered in a medical centre, Sebulba persuaded race officials to auction off Guo's belongings, including mechanic Trax Bonkick. Tinto Pagalis had purchased Trax's brother Pax prior to the auction, and would eventually manage to buy Trax and reunite the brothers. As for Mars Guo, he eventually made it back to Fu, though it was some time before he set out pod racing again. Mars Guo's pod racer uses a pair of Color Pondrat Plug 2 Behemoth engines. In terms of overall bulk, these are some of the largest on the circuit, if not actually the largest. Despite its apparently cumbersome build, the racer offers good turning, great cooling thanks to its massive air intakes, and fairly solid speed and acceleration. It was able to push to a top speed of 790 km an hour, its cockpit measured 4.11 meters long, and the engines are 7.24 meters long. As we can see from the base stats, Mars Guo is pretty solid. The cooling is actually quite bad, given what the game what Wikipedia mentions, at least as far as the movie went, but we can see that he's going to be a fairly capable racer, at least if base stats are anything to go by. It seems like, as far as the game goes, all those massive air intakes are actually good for is having a bit of scrap thrown in them by a certain Dug.
Change your mind.
So, as far as traction goes, Mars Guo will still have fairly good traction, probably due to the weight of his engines working well with the repulsor grips. When it comes to handling, he will perform fairly well there as well. In fact, he'll do quite spectacularly. Acceleration will not be spectacular. It will be a bit higher than average, but overall, it isn't super spectacular. On the other hand, he's hitting top speed with a plug 8, which makes him one of the quicker racers out there. Braking proves fairly capable. As we can see, he'll hit top with the Quadrajet, and his cooling will not be anything to write home about. The repair, on the other hand, will generally serve him very well. If he needs to fix those massive engines up, then he can do that. He probably learned from Sebulba throwing scrap into them. Well, for all his bragging and boastfulness, it does seem like Mars Guo has actually posted some pretty solid times. Those Plug 2 behemoth engines aren't just for show, their sheer size packs plenty of power in there. However, it's not quite enough to take the top times, unfortunately, though Mars Guo has done pretty well for himself, all things considered. He has posted a time of 2 minutes 1.71 seconds. Not too shabby, but there is still a little bit of room for improvement. There was a fairly consistent grouping of times all around, but will he be surpassed by the next racer in our list? Let's take a look now at Ebe Endocott. Ebe Endocott was well known for a range of daredevil stunts even before his pod racing career began. The Triffian thrill seeker had wound up with a large scar on his stomach after a swoop accident during his delivery driving work, but this did not deter him one bit. He initially started out in land speeder racing but made his way to the pod racing circuit and settled into the semi-pro leagues. Endocott developed quite an ego, but he at least had the skills to back it up. He would actually win 3 consecutive championships on Malastare. As a sign of his skill, Endocott earned the status of track favourite on Burundi's notorious Fire Mountain Rally, a particularly twisty course. Endocott's pod racer was able to perform well on the track due to its sharp handling, as it had proven on Malastare's Doug Derby circuit. Not satisfied with this, Endocott sought to defeat Sebulba and take over the Doug's status as Malastare's media favourite. To that end, he sought to defeat Sebulba in the Boonta Classic. While Endocott's race would have far less drama than many of the contenders, this was an advantage to a degree. While he did not win the race, and just missed out on the podium due to finishing 4th, Sebulba didn't finish at all due to his crash while trying to destroy Anakin Skywalker's pod. Ebe Endocott would ultimately consider this a fair enough victory over Sebulba. Endocott's career would continue through the years, and he was still racing on circuits throughout the galaxy around 22 BBY. Little about these later years has been reported save that Endocott took part in races across planets such as Tatooine, Felucia, and even Coruscant. Ebe Endocott's pod racer sports two JAK Racing J930-8 engines. It's well renowned for its excellent traction. The precise handling of the craft also made it particularly useful across many twisting courses. Endocott interestingly modified the cockpit by elevating the seating so he could see clearly ahead of his racer, but would also allow his fans to see him while racing. The guy had a bit of an ego in all fairness, but he could back it up. The cockpit is listed as being 3.05 metres long and the engines are 9.55 metres long. We do not actually know the listed top speed of this particular pod racer. As we can see, very good traction, very good cooling, and pretty good repair straight off the bat. The brakes aren't great, but overall, Ebe Endocott serves as a pretty effective early racer, given that he's one of the starters.
Back again, huh?
So when it comes to upgrading his parts, small boost from the R60, but he'll jump ahead pretty well overall. He's not going to quite reach the top of traction, but he'll do particularly well. When it comes to handling, he will start out reasonably solid and stay that way with pretty good stats with a control stabilizer. When it comes to acceleration, it seems that nobody really jumps ahead particularly well, so he'll sit at about half with the accelerators. When it comes to our top speed, he will actually hit top speed with a block 5, which gives him a pretty capable top speed. I sort of got a bit stuck there. Air brakes, on the other hand, he'll start out fairly crummy, but will still do pretty well with a quadrajet. Braking is generally a capable stat for most people. As for cooling, look at that. He's going to be very close to top, which allows him to boost spectacularly well. And the repair, as we can see, holds up particularly well. This is probably one of the better racers out there, and given you get him right from the start, this is one you really can't go wrong with. After an admittedly shocking start, which was entirely the fault of yours truly here, Ebe Endocott really got through his paces and showed off some very impressive times. A marked difference from my rather terrible performance in the initial run, but then we have a very nice cluster of times that stick fairly close together, but while they're not quite top of the table, they are nonetheless still particularly good. Our best time is 2 minutes 1.045 seconds. That's a pretty impressive time for a beginning racer. In fact, it's probably one of the best times of the beginning races so far. Although, in fairness, when I actually look at the list, we've done Anakin and Ebe Endocott. We still have Dudbolt, Gasgano, Elan Mac, and Odie Mandrell to go. So, wow, best of two. Really, really clever there. Anyway, we are all done for this particular episode. Next time, we are actually looking at two more starting races, Dudbolt and Gasgano. We'll see how they go when it comes to the lap times, and we'll get a bit of information about them. As always, thank you very much for joining me. It is a pleasure having you. Until next time, this is Red 2 returning to base. May the Force be with you.